There we go. All right. Hi, I'm Kelly Baptista, and I'm going to be leading us all on a discussion today with our three panelists through quality assurance, not just a stepping stone. We'll be discussing the idea today that quality assurance, also known as QA, is not just a stepping stone into tech or games, and we're here to showcase three great stories of success and development in the field. We've got Jessica Taylor here with us, Melissa Russell, and Sam Harrell. I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves because we'd like to hear each of their very interesting and unique stories behind how they got into this field. And I think let's start with Sam. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself as a QA lead?
So my name's Sam Harrell, and I was raised in North Carolina, Hosky, North Carolina, actually. And I went to school at NC State, and I decided to major in computer science under their engineering department. Worked as an intern for 2 summers with Microsoft, and then I got a full-time position at Microsoft. Worked there for 6 years, left, worked for the government for 2 years, moved back to Seattle, and worked for Microsoft again for a total of 19 years. And then I decided I wanted to do something different. The majority of my time was spent in QA. I did do some dev work. I did do some ops work as well. But what I enjoyed the most was QA. And I got into QA by fluke of my internship because I wanted to be a dev. And my QA manager told me at the time, the best devs at Microsoft started out as SDATs and testers, and they wrote better code. And so I was always writing code was an art for me at the time. So therefore I wanted to be the best at my art. So I took the path, and I found that it was very interesting, and there's way more sets of problems to solve in the QA space, as well, making sure things are working well and making customers happy. So.
Cool. And just for the audience, could you explain what an SDET is?
SDAT is called a software design engineering test. Basically a developer, someone at the same level as a developer that chooses to focus on tests. You write automation, you build harnesses, you get into the code just like the devs do and search for problems, and you may do performance work as well. So you have to really understand as equal much as devs do.
Cool. And then could you elaborate a little bit on how that is super important for a company?
It's super important because most developers want to work on customer facing stuff. And so to find someone who finds joy in finding the bugs and making sure the quality is there and making sure removing all the little things that could potentially bother customers and make them happy is super important because in the era when I started out, everything was put in a box. You got a CD in a box, and it costs money to press those CDs. Then it costs money to put them in the box and ship them out to people. And when there was a bug to where you have to recall all of that, it costs money to get it all the way back. So it was super important then. Now the era is, can you build tools to detect things in the space that we're in now, where everything's in the cloud?
Thanks. All right. So who would like to go next? I think we'll pick Melissa.
I know, put on the hot seat. Well, I'm Melissa. I'm up in the Seattle area. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I got into QA on accident. I was working as a office manager at a veterinary office, and I wanted to get into game dev. So I was teaching myself programming, and I was trying to do everything I could at home. I answered a Craigslist advertisement asking for baby devs, and they called me while I was out shopping asking if I could start on Monday, and I was like, yeah, let's get into it. And so my interview process was, have you seen computers before, and do you know anything about Marvel Comics? And that was great. I just went in, and it was like I knew more about computers than they had given me credit for, and I ended up, I think within a week, I ended up being the lead on that project. And yeah, it was a very interesting learning experience. I got to take my office manager skills and structure like what we needed to do in the day and what our expectations were. And then I got to talk to the developers and be like, what do you need me to do? What do you need out of QA? And it was very much learning on the fly. What is this? What is expected out of me? What kind of tools do we have? How many people do I need to do this? And yeah, it was a very interesting. I really wanted to get into programming, but it was really cool to get in there and see a little bit of everything. It was just, you got to touch art, you got to touch the management, the milestones, you got to see how the designers worked, how things were argued and sent back and forth, and how you landed on what went into games and what didn't go into games, and how things got decided to get cut. And you know, occasionally I did get to do scripting, and you know, occasionally I got to do websites, and occasionally I got to do customer-facing things. So it was just a little bit of everything, and I kind of fell in love with it and have stayed with it.
Thank you. Looks like it's your turn, Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Taylor. I am, like everyone else here, QA lead. I similarly, I guess, accidentally ended up in QA. I got a degree in computer science, and my last year, I was interviewing for a developer position at Microsoft, and it went poorly. I made the mistake of telling the developer that I was in the process of taking an algorithms class, and then he decided to drill me on a bunch of algorithms, and it went really poorly. So the email I got back was, we don't think you're strong enough for a developer position, but we'd be willing, if you think you're smart enough, to interview you for an SDET position. And in my hubris, I said, of course I'm smart enough. And so I got hired as an SDET, and I did that for a year and a half before I got laid off. And then I ended up taking a position at Starbucks, where I was for 4 years. I wasn't super into test at the time, just because the team I was hired onto originally at Microsoft and all that kind of stuff worked on stuff that I wasn't really interested in and I didn't know a lot about. They hired me on to do networking stuff for Windows to make sure that you know, your Wi-Fi chip basically was connecting and all that kind of stuff. And I took 0 classes on Wi-Fi and networking. So it just didn't really click for me. At Starbucks though, I ended up actually really clicking with it. It got to the point where I was more familiar with the entire ecosystem of the Starbucks system than most of the developers I was working with at the time. Because a lot of the times by finding bugs and figuring out what caused it to happen and figuring out what the fix actually was, ended up being like, oh, I know that this system is actually hooked up into this other system that this team works on, but that one doesn't, and I know how it works, so people have to come to me to figure out why their stuff isn't working anymore. And I really felt like I meshed with that a lot. I really felt like I enjoyed being more of a knowledgeable on like the system as a whole and like why this and why that. And a lot of the times when you're developing, like, you know, you get very integrated on this is your feature, this is what you're doing, you need to make sure that this thing works. But with, you know, test, like, you have to have more information there because it's the only way that you're going to figure out, oh, I went and I made this change on my account, but then it ended up messing up something completely different. And I won't look for that if I don't know that those are connected in some way. So I ended up at Niantic because my original dream in the first place is that I wanted to get into games anyways. And I figured that a developer role was my gateway to get there. And actually it worked out significantly better going on the QA SDET route for me. Basically, I saw a job posting one day and I was like, I'll go for it. Like, I don't expect anything, but they called me back and I was like, oh, okay. So no, I think it's been really great. I love being like kind of a subject matter expert from a different perspective. I love needing to be the kind of person that you know, can figure out how things break, why things break, and provide solutions before anyone's even opened up the code, kind of a thing, you know, and unblock people when things are going wrong. But yeah, I mean, that's basically kind of the long short of it. It wasn't on purpose, but I think it ended up being the right choice.
Thank you for that. Okay, so now that we've gotten to know a little bit about how each of you came into this QA journey, what has been the biggest challenge so far for each of you in your career? And I think we'll start with Melissa this time.
Oh, I think the biggest challenge that I've encountered in QA and in game dev has been the lack of a formal education. Like I said, I responded to a Craigslist ad, and then I went in and I was just on the job, and I was kind of learning on the fly and applying things that I'd learned through other jobs and through experience and through Google searches. And I was a really good QA tester. Like, I was teaching other people how to do it, and I was on multiple projects, and you know, everybody was like, hey, why don't you continue to do this? You know, what do you want out of this? And whenever I would apply, whenever I would aspire to do something better, the instant reaction I would get was, well, you didn't go to school for a comp sci degree, so you're clearly not experienced enough to do the job you're already doing. And so it's always been like a weird feedback loop of, I'm already doing this. Like, I can tell you what he does, I can tell you what she does, I can tell you what they do, but for some reason I don't have it on paper. So that's always been the weird. I have to find the networking in order to talk to people and prove that I am doing what I already do in order to go anywhere, in order to get anything, versus apparently being able to say, hey, I went to school at, you know, this school and I can just get this job that I want. So that's been a little frustrating for me.
I can imagine. All right, let's go with Sam next. What has been the biggest challenge for you so far in your career?
Because I choose QA route, that I am not a true dev. I do not understand, or I cannot attain levels that devs are. And yeah, and that's been since I came into the industry back in '98. And then they're always surprised that once it gets down to it, that I understand, I know, I can fix, I can extrapolate, I can extend everything they do, and then make sure it's of high quality. So it's just going through those rigors of constantly having to prove yourself every time you encounter a new dev, unless you're just in. So I move around a lot in different groups and stuff like that. So when you go to a new company or a new thing, it's kind of like the devs like, oh yeah, it's another QA person. And then they realize like, oh, you actually understand code, which the relationship gets better at that point. But they're like, until they make that assessment of, wow, you actually can code and you actually know these and these algorithms and you're speaking code to me, then they kind of shun you a little bit, right? They figure like you just won't understand. And I was like, oh no, I understand. And I also know how to translate so that I don't have to repeat this over and over again. And then they're a little more trusting. So the biggest thing is gaining the trust of my fellow developers off tops.
I see. Melissa and Jessica, it looks like you both have been agreeing with what Sam's been saying. Is there some things you could say to elaborate on that? Because it looks like you both had a similar experience.
Sure, I can definitely elaborate on that. I mean, it definitely ties into, like I was saying about my original journey anyways, right? Where I had this interview where they were like, oh, well, you know, not smart enough to reach this bar, but we think you can meet this bar where you also still write code and do code things, where they're treated kind of differently, even at that level. But there's definitely been a lot of moments in my life, right, where it's like, you'll go to a dev and you'll be like, oh, this thing is broken. Like, especially when you're just starting, right? Like Sam was saying, you're not familiar with the way the whole thing works yet. You wouldn't be expected to. It's like your first month on the job or whatever. And, you know, you'll go to someone and be like, hey, this is broken. and they'll be like, okay, just give it to me. And they won't tell you why it was broken or like give you any indication. Like, unless you poke them sometimes, it's like, hey, could you tell me why it's broken? Like, because that'll help me in the future. And then when I know that, and if it's something that I can fix on my own, like maybe my configuration was just bad, I don't have to come to you every time, but there's just this assumption that I won't get it, or like, just it's easier for me to just fix it for you than increase your knowledge because you won't get it, right? There's definitely like some of that where it does take time. It's like you have to prove yourself sometimes, depending on the dev. Definitely not everyone is like that for sure by any means, but a lot of the times just because there's like not much understanding or learning between what a QA is capable of. A lot of the times there's just this thought of like, oh, like this is someone that we pulled off the street and said, just poke at this and see if it works. I don't know, right? And that's not the case, right? Like there's a lot of experience and learning and stuff that's in there, but it can be like a challenge, right? Like showing I have the chops for this. Believe in me, please. Like,
Yeah, so it sounds like that's a misunderstanding that Melissa and Sam have felt as well. Is there something you'd like to tell us about that as well, or have you had that experience in your career?
Yeah, there's a very big perception of you were in QA because you couldn't make it anywhere else, and that's a complete falsehood. And I'm not sure where that started. I mean, I can't imagine, I can't remember anybody posting on Craigslist, hey, we need 6 Unity devs this week, come on in. But I don't know what kind of quality bar you're setting if that's what you're expecting out of QA, because you are the quality bar at quality assurance. So your expectations for your product is going to be based on what kind of professionals you're bringing in to help finish up and polish your product. So for the pure and simple fact that you as a developer or you as somebody in software would think that the people you are hiring are not as smart as the rest of the people you are hiring is kind of like, it's putting yourself down at that point. And it's something that you run into a lot where people are like, well, you're just QA. And it's like, but I work with you, I'm a colleague, I'm also on this project, like everybody's invested in this, and I don't understand why we can't work together and trust each other.
And some of the irony of it all, most QA loops include devs. So you get devs that are like, you know, that interview you and take you through loops. And so you have to do all the stuff like you would do in a dev loop, but then you get this extra piece of, hey, so now do you know how to break all this stuff that you wrote? And then you're sitting there and you're like, okay, so I just got tested like a dev would. So why wouldn't I be on the same level as a dev? You know, and it's those things. Or there's the reverse that happens. You go to a dev and you start speaking QA language and trying to help them understand why this is a bug, why the customer will be a problem, and extrapolate for them how many times this happens and why this piece of code here, and you could even point them to a line of code and they'll still doubt you. And even though with all the evidence, there's some like that, but like Jessica said, there's not, some of them are say thank you. There's quite a few out there that will say thank you and be like, oh, okay, go ahead, check that in. Or they'll be like, oh, yeah, well, I'll look at it later. I don't think that's what it is. And then they'll come back and tell you that's exactly what it is. But they thought of it, not you.
Do you think there's anything, or what in your experience could be done to kind of, you know, fix this misunderstanding that QA is not necessarily on the same level?
I think it starts in schools. I literally tried after 2 summers to go back to my school at NC State and get a QA class because it's a chapter in a book when you're on the computer science level, when you're doing computer science and you're getting a degree in programming. And it's only a chapter and be like, oh yeah, and you test it. But they don't go into techniques or the types of tests or all the things that are required. But then you get out in the industry and they feel that they can take anybody who's a dev because you've shown that you're of a certain level of intelligence and just throw them in and they'll be a good QA. And I don't think that is true. With it, there are some learnings you have to learn. There's some unlearnings you have to learn from being a dev, because the bugs hide in places where you don't normally would look, right? Like Jessica was saying earlier, that, hey, I changed this did everything it was supposed to, but 3 parts of the system down, it blew up something else because it didn't expect me to put in another ampersand or something like that. So, little things like that, harmless things that you don't think is a problem up front, but causes catastrophes and take down whole networks later. So you have to start thinking about those things. And that's a totally different mindset.
Yeah, I mean, to add to exactly what Sam's saying, I had one class in college for testing. And I know for a lot of students, even myself at the time, like we took it and it was like, writing tests for your code is the most boring thing. I hate writing comments. I hate writing tests. I hate that 30% of my grade on this project is whether or not I wrote enough unit tests. But what I remember my orientation day for my SDET role, and they put a whole bunch of us into a room, everyone's first day or whatever, and they were like, so who here has any experience in testing things? And I was the only person who raised my hand. So I was the only person who had had even just a class, like a single half semester class on testing things that they had hired on for this role. And it was just kind of like mind boggling because like they gave us some exercises to do of like, here's a thing, how would you come up with test cases for it? And I was like, oh, well, okay, so we should write up these big old circles. And I'm writing up all this crap that I remember from my test class. And everyone's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you? I'm like, oh, well, this is the test matrix. And they're like, what? What are you, why would you do that? And like, I definitely do think that, yeah, there's a lot of perception change that could happen just at that point, right? Like you haven't started your career yet, but like, we're not treating this like it's a thing you can even do or that you would want to do, right?
I'm going to take it a slightly different direction. I think it's a systemic thing in tech where we don't value and we don't hire people based on soft skills or empathy. QA would be a lot better if communication would start a little bit higher up. And even in QA, I've seen people who are professional QA testers that get hung up on like specific localization strings or timestamp issues or weird hacks that you would do as a QA person, and they will completely overlook something simple in a first user experience based on somebody who has never played your game before. I've encountered that a lot in a lot of different like packaged, we're going to do this kind of game, but it's just going to have this kind of skin on it, where they assume the developers, the entire QA team, everybody from the head down will assume that this is how your market looks and this is who's going to be coming into it and this is the knowledge set that they'll have going into it. And a lot of the really big bugs that come into it are just a matter of people not asking who else is looking at it or like what kind of personalities. So I think just having a little bit of empathy and a little bit more diversity in your trying to aim for a little more inclusiveness would make it a lot better for a lot of QAs and the development company as a whole.
Well, thank you all for your thoughts on that. I'd like to jump into your thoughts on QA as a career. And we kind of touched on that a little bit. I think Sam has been in QA the longest of everybody, so we can go ahead and start there. So what are your thoughts on QA as a career?
I think it's a beautiful career. I actually switched to dev and then came back to QA. I felt like I had more problems or had to be more creative as QA. I had my better experiences and felt more creative doing QA work. What is also interesting in the industry now, in tech industry, I haven't seen it in gaming yet, but I'm still very much a baby in gaming. They're starting to have devs do testing as well, right? Their own testing. And there's a large backlash against it, right? Like devs are not really, pure devs are not really happy about it. While SDATs are like, hey, I've been doing this all along. Like, great, welcome to my world. Uh, so it's also, so I hope schools will start to invest more into quality assurance and showing that there is a path into it. That, just being a great dev doesn't necessarily make you a good QA, but I think, as Melissa pointed out, also, there's a mindset behind it. There's having empathy, there's ability to think, yeah, I know how I feel about this, and I know what we're saying, but is that true? Like, what are the numbers? And a lot of QA are starting to head into data science as well, because those numbers help drive what they're actually saying, right? And there's the proof, there's the quality, and hold the quality bar and help make more intelligent decisions. So I find that QA is more expansive in what you're doing. You're a little more holistic in essence. So there's many paths you can do starting out in QA.
Cool. Well, thank you. Jessica, Melissa, would you like to elaborate on that? Thoughts on QA as a career?
Yeah, I can elaborate. I think what's usually missing from that decision point is knowing what the real difference is, because it is a very different mindset. There is, if you're more very specifically analytical and you're very good with numbers and logic problems, I think developer is probably more along your path. But if you're more along the lines of, I'm not sure exactly, like there's a very different way to think about a piece of code in terms of, does it do exactly the thing I want it to do versus what are the ways this could go wrong? And like, I've seen it before because I've interviewed developers for SDET positions before. And you ask them, hey, write code that will do X, Y, and Z. And they do it really fast and it's great and it works. And then you're like, okay, now come up with test cases for this. And they're like, well, I would test the highest possible number and the lowest possible number. And it's like, okay, that's great, but what about 5? And they're like, why would I test 5? And I'm like, well, it does different stuff in your code for 5 or 4. Those are different test cases, right? Like it's kind of more of like a mapping problem, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what the right word to put to it is, but it is a very different thought process, right? So you're solving different puzzles, right? One of them is just like get to the answer as fast as possible, and one of them is like, how many different ways can I do this thing? Like if you've ever watched like a speed run of like a game or something like that, the things that they're doing in that are the things that they find. That's a QA mindset. That's like, can I push my face into this exact corner of this wall and get through to the other end, right? Which is not, the developer's like, I made the wall is there, I push my face up against it, in general it's there, right? And then the QA is just like, but there's this pixel. Like that's kind of the deal, right? So there isn't a right answer between one or the other, but there's probably one that you will like significantly more, or that fits the way that your mind works, because they are really different.
Yeah, I think QA in itself is kind of a broad and beautiful discipline, in that there is no one way to describe what it is. There's no one set of expectations out of it. So it's kind of unfair to say I did QA as a career, because it's going to change depending on what project you're with, what group you're with, what team you're on, what kind of software you're doing, what kind of level you're at. It can be everything from, I want to take the toaster apart and put it back together and make it do toast again, to I want to take it apart and then it's going to be it's going to sync up with Alexa when I'm done with it, or it's going to turn into a Nerf gun. Like you can do all sorts of things as QA, and there's really no limitation. You can be a sound QA, you can be a client QA, you can be the playtest experience, you can be the speedrunner QA. There are many different facets and disciplines of QA. And
you can be a PM too.
You can be a what?
You could be a PM.
You could be a project manager. You could, yeah. There's my favorites are like the QA people who end up going into like speedrunning. Yeah, they'll go in and they'll be like, I'm gonna go do the videos for marketing because I know exactly how to do this in under 3 minutes without cutting the footage, and I'm gonna do. And it's just like, all right, you just went completely into like film production in your brand of QA. Like, is that what you want to do? Is that so? It's very interesting, and I think QA touches so many different pieces that it can be seen as an entry level gateway into the industry. But realize if you're getting into QA is going to be its own discipline, and if what you really want to do is production, or if you really want to be a dev, don't spend time in QA. Like go pursue that. That's going to do more value to you to go work on an art portfolio and then apply for art positions than it will be to spend time in QA and learn all the QA pieces and then have a QA resume that is going to be looked at as QA when you want to go do a different position. So QA is just fascinating as the type of personality that wants to go in and take apart the puzzle and then sort the pieces by shape and color or edges first, or it's going to be the sorting personality that likes to go through and document things and see how things break, versus the other pieces that may be more creative, trying to draw things or art things or trying to code things or trying to come up with more efficient ways to do things. So it's just figure out what you're looking for before you decide that that's the career that you want, or that's going to be the gateway that you're trying to get into.
And my last comment, if you like breaking things and understand how it works and you still want to code and create, you can do that. You can create frameworks for people to automate tests. Nothing best to see that you're sitting back, you press a button and you get to test all these things and make the UI go crazy and do all sorts of stuff. And you can actually find bugs that you wouldn't normally find by somebody just human clicking.
So I think this is the first time we've sort of touched on QA not just being a stepping stone. And it sounds like from what Melissa just said that there are plenty of tracks and paths you can go on within it, and all of them sound very well-rounded. Is that something you found, Sam, in your long career?
I am very well-rounded. I started out tracking bugs, just opening bugs. And then when I started doing is looking at the bugs in a spreadsheet, and I'm like, hey, this one particular area seems to have a lot of bugs of this level. What's wrong with this code here? And then I started learning devs. Certain devs have certain flaws that they tend to put in code. And so once you know somebody wrote some code, then you can I know exactly where to go to find the most egregious bugs that we would care about. And then I worked with partners that helped show them how to use some of the APIs that I was testing, because I had the most knowledge base of it, and it helped them fix their errors or, work around bugs we had until we fixed them and stuff like that. So you do get to be very well-rounded. You can have a plethora of things that you find interesting. You can almost make QA what you want it. It just depends on how much you really want to drive. You can find, because what happens is sometimes in some positions I've had, I ended up picking all the things up that I knew were important, but nobody wanted to do. Right. And I added value and quality and increased quality through applying those things and showing that these metrics or the stuff I'm doing is actually important and makes for a better product. So, yeah, you get a lot more flexibility. You're not just sitting there doing code all the time. You can do code for periods, and you can go and run data sheets and models for the longest time, right? And you can learn a lot of different things. So I would say it's probably one of the more well-rounded industries. And like I also say, you be a PM. I actually drove a dev team through the bugs I opened, or showing them these are the most impactful bugs that are impact users, and we'll get better quality from doing this.
Any other thoughts on that, or shall we move on?
Sure, I can add to that. Because yeah, what Sam's saying is very true. Like my title in general hasn't been too different over time, but like there was a portion of time at Microsoft where I was doing data science. I was building graphs for them when they started taking a lot of telemetry. and showing them like, here's where most of our null reference exceptions and stuff like that. So I wasn't testing so much as just like grabbing data and being like, I don't have to test this, but the data shows you that this is a big chunk of our pie. And then like, I think at Starbucks, like I wrote at least a handful of different tools that we would just use for testing to make testing easier for ourselves and for our manual QA. I think they still use those tools. Like it was something that I just built because people were pinging me a lot saying, hey, I need coupons on this account. And I'm like, I don't want to keep doing this every time. Like, so I'm just gonna write you this tool and you let me know if it breaks and I will fix it. But here you go, right? And it was something like that the devs weren't gonna have time to do, but I did, right? I also had like a side project where I was showing, I ended up doing like this model of the Earth showing like our basically our incoming orders via our mobile app, like over time. And so it would show these little graphs on like the globe as it like over time, and they'd grow in Europe and then you'd see them go down and then go up in America and stuff. Like, is like most people would be like, that's not testing anything, right? Like, what did you gain from that? And it's like, well, we gained knowledge, right? We know that at this time, like this is where, you know, we're seeing big spikes in errors at 4 a.m. What's active in 4 a.m. Europe, like stuff like that, right? Things that like, if someone had asked me, hey, you think you're gonna do some 3D modeling? I was like, no, I did anyways, right? So there's definitely been a lot of opportunity for just weird gimmicky projects because like you just touch so many things, you know how to get this data, you know where it is, like all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of variety basically up for grabs in that kind of career track.
Well, thank you all for the awesome thoughts on that. So lastly, I think I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on where you see quality assurance as a whole in 5 to 10 years. And that can be your career, the entire industry, etc. I'll let you go for it. Melissa, why don't we start with you this time?
I think quality assurance will probably be a little more technical as we go on. I think it's going to turn into more automation testing. It needs to have more soft skills in people actually sitting down and playing the games, and that's kind of where we're at in the gaming industry now. It's a lot of hands-on ad hoc testing from people, but there are so many different scenarios that happen that it needs to have more automation skills, there's a lot of room to grow. There's the industry is growing, the technology is growing. We're seeing just leaps and bounds in different technological advances, and trying to make sure that that's a good experience for everyone is going to be a continuously evolving creature. So that's going to be something that, you know, if you have the opportunity to learn, continue to learn, pick up new skills that you wouldn't normally pick up, because they will surprise you. You know, I didn't think mobile testing would ever be my thing, because who would have a phone? Why would you be using Google on your cell phone? And now I do mobile game dev. So there's that. And then you start looking at weird things as a QA tester. I keep looking at like fitness trackers, and I'm like, how would you test that? How would you look at that? And that turns into like conversations about how did that come about? Where is that going? So you can definitely just continue to learn. And it will definitely surprise me within next year, let alone 5 years to 10 years. I would like to see it turn into a little more of an inclusive environment where you're brought in higher up in the engineering field, so that considerations for users and end users are a little more considered before it gets down to being QA, having to throw everything at the wall and see what happens and what needs to be considered.
Jessica, did you want to add to
that? Yeah, I pretty much agree, or rather, like, that's kind of where I hope things are going to go. I do think that a lot of places have been struggling to be convinced that things like automation are a worthy thing to invest in. I totally understand that it does take a lot of time and resources to get going, but like the time save once it's there is just astronomical. Like, if you don't have to have someone verify every time that login works, and they don't have to spend their time doing that anymore, because a computer can do it at 3 in the morning instead, like that's huge time save for everybody. So those are definitely the things I want to see. I also definitely agree on, like, I think you'll hear, if you start studying software in any way, shape, or form, you'll start hearing about different development cycle types. And the one that you'll hear as the big no-no is waterfall, which is where you plan something, you develop it, and then literally the last thing you do is test it. And then you ship it out the door. And even though it's a big no-no, everybody does it. So I really hope that, like, as an industry, we're really pushing to get more into like the continuous development cycle, which is more of like I make a very small change as a developer, and then QA gets it pretty much immediately and is like, yeah, that change did what you want it to, instead of being like, big feature, you don't see that big feature until it's done. And then we hand you that big feature, and then you go, I don't even know how to work with this. Like, how many things does this touch? I don't know, because it's huge. Like, if you only gave me this chunk of it at first, I could fully vet that in a day and be like, it's good, but now that it's part of this whole thing, like, I'm like, oh gosh, no, I don't like that. So these are the things that, like, are definitely have been talked about for a while. I remember, again, like, so school was almost a decade ago now. So, like, I remember that being what I was told in school, and then I'm still kind of like, I thought you said this was gonna happen. Like, I'm just so, like, these are definitely more of like, I do think we are still making steps in that direction as an industry. I just hope that we continue to, and that, you know, incremental improvements over time, continuous development of development, basically, is where we're kind of going.
Sam, I think we have time for a quick thought from you if you'd like to expand on that at all.
Quick thought for me, coming from non-gaming, I think they have a large value for QA because of there's a sense of automation, and a lot of the OSs have automation built into it, or the ability to automate. There's a sense that QA can move a lot faster. And then we get trapped up in areas like Jessica was saying, that they give you something at the last minute that's rather large with no details about it. And then you're supposed to test it and be like, well, you can use automation. Well, it still takes time to think about it and make sure you cover things. So I hope the planning part gets better and there's more respect for QA in the planning part, knowing that quality does matter. Not just saying it, but actually showing it through making sure there's time for it. Also, moving into gaming, I think gaming will expand as it starts doing automation. There's a few frameworks I'm seeing, and this will be my first foray into automating games on a mobile device. So I have a lot of brains I can come with, but it's still a different beast. So I think that there will be growth there in automation and advancement in gaming QA. As more and more people come from a tech industry and start thinking about stuff, like people like me, more and more come over and bring over ideas, but then also curve it with, okay, we have gaming and we may be 10 light years behind right now, but with people thinking about the problem, it will actually advance and move forward.
Cool. Well, last question for all of you. If folks would like to find you on social media, how can they do that? Feel free to pass if you'd like.
I will say that I just don't social media. So good luck finding me there, I guess.
Melissa?
You can get a hold of me on Twitter at VirusQ, VIRUSQ. That is my personal Twitter, so it is full of anime and video games, but occasionally I will drop something about the industry.
Sam?
If you're looking for me, good old-fashioned LinkedIn. Sam G. Harrell on LinkedIn is where you can find me, and it's pretty much boring, but I'm willing to talk to anybody. So if you message me, I'll, give advice, talk, point you in the right direction of people that I know and stuff like that.
All right, and like Jessica, I also do not social media. So I wanted to thank all three of you for talking and giving us some really great advice and insight on QA as a whole. We'll be hosting a Q&A session in Discord, and the link will be provided shortly. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.